and thank you so much for inviting me here to talk about these things this morning. Codling moth is a perennial favorite topic. I bet you haven't had a tree fruit apple day in since recorded time where codling moth hasn't been under discussion. It's just one of those pests that won't go away. It's been our key pest since we started growing apples in the 1880s, and I really don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. Before I talk about some new approaches, I also want to cover just a few basic principles. And the first basic principle is that everything I talk about assumes that you are using mating disruption. So that is the base, that is the foundation, and then there are other things that we put on top of that to make sure that we keep our codling moth under control. So why will codling moth always be a pest? Here's just a few ideas. First of all, for fresh fruit growers, not for process, but we're a fresh fruit state, the consumer gets to see that apple. If there's any pest damage, it's going to be pretty apparent to them. You can't hide that in a can of puree. It is a direct and internal pest, which means it's going to be living inside that fruit, and consumers don't like that. The economic injury level is therefore very, very low. When you compare it to something like a mite or an aphid, the economic injury level is just abysmally low. And you, on top of that, you put some quarantine restrictions, some export restrictions, and that again forces that economic injury level to a very, very low point. We don't really have an effective way of sorting out codling moth damage on the packing line. It slows down our lines, it's hard to catch everything, and that means when it comes into the packing house, it's got to have a very low level of damage. And last, we count on biological control in so many situations, but codling moth really just isn't one of them. That makes me sad as an entomologist. I wish it were. But when your economic injury level is so low and biological control presumes that you have to have some population to keep it going or an alternative host, it's unlike, it could suppress it, but it may take you, without anything else, it may take you from 75% fruit damage down to 30% fruit damage. And 30% fruit damage is still a disaster in anybody's book. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the codling moth model. This was brought to Washington from Michigan State University in the 1980s by Jay Bruner. Jay saw had the vision to see the need for this model and started developing it in the state of Washington. There's a couple of things that are really important about the model that I think we sort of forget. First of all, it uses 4 life stages, not just one. Not just the one that we typically see in our traps, all 4 life stages. What it does that's really, really important is it lets you see what's happening with the life stages that are very hard to find in the field. How many of you have ever gone out to your orchard and seen a bunch of codling moths flying around? How many people have done that? If so, you've got way too many codling moth. I've only done it once or twice. And I work in some of the most infested orchards in the state, our research orchards. We do a good job at producing codling moth, but they're still not terribly apparent. Eggs are really tough to find. You can find them if you look hard enough and long enough in an infested orchard, but they're hard to find. What's really apparent is the larvae, because they leave that external damage on the surface of the fruit, whether it's a sting or an entry. If you cut it open, you know where to go look for those larvae. And then pupae, you can sample for the pupae if you are willing to dig around on the trunks of the trees or put out bands. But basically the model is telling you, without you having to go out and look for all these things, the model is telling you what's happening basically from March to October, what's happening with all these different stages. And I can't tell you how valuable that is when you're trying to develop a management program. So here we have the WSU Decision Aids program, and this is, I call it the Cadillac option of implementing models. It integrates weather data with our biological information that we have on codling moth and presents it to you along with recommendations for control, both organic and conventional. And this is the brainchild of Vince Jones, who started developing it about 18 years ago. And in, I think it was 2021, the directorship was taken over by Dr. David Crowder, also of the Department of Entomology at WSU. And this is unfortunately available by subscription rather than free the way it used to be, but it is still an incredible amount of information presented in a pretty fabulous manner. So here is the familiar output that you've probably seen from the codling moth model, and these are the cumulative curves of all these 4 stages: egg, larvae, pupae, and adult. The stage that we observe most often, other than fruit damage, and a lot of us don't have that much fruit damage in our orchards, so the stage we observe most often is actually the adults, and that's thanks to pheromone traps. Adults are hard to come by unless you draw them into you looking for them versus them coming to you. And then all of a sudden you can see, oh yeah, there's quite a few adults floating around here. Now, we used to be able to kill adults with our insecticides. I don't think we really can to any extent anymore. But the target these days is really that the eggs and the newly hatched larvae before they get into the fruit. Once they get into the fruit, game over. You already have the damage, or you already have the larvae who's safe and protected. So eggs and the larvae as it's wandering around looking for a place to bite into. Realistically, pupae are almost never a target for control sprays. They're very resistant to sprays, and they're going to be in a place that's hard to get to anyways. So our 2 target stages that the model tells us about so nicely are the eggs and those very young larvae. So just some basic stuff about the codling moth phenology model. It's based on temperatures. It's temperature driven. Insects respond to varying levels of temperature. Don showed you some fabulous graphs about cool years and hot years and how that changes, how quickly codling moth can develop. And this is all based on degree days and the model. It uses actually the development of an individual and then applies the probability or percentage of that individual moving to the next stage. But it's based on, and it was developed with, an undisturbed and unsprayed population. Once you start to spray something, you really mess it up. So we're talking about what codling moth does when you leave codling moth alone. Like I said, it uses all 4 life stages, and it's not a population dynamics model. We know what percentage of the population is moving forward, but we don't know what N is. We don't know how many, whether you have 10 moths, 100 moths, or 10,000 moths out there. So it is, again, there's some things that it does, and there's some things that it doesn't do. The most accessible and used method of sampling codling moth is capturing adults in pheromone traps. And this was one of the first uses after they discovered the nature of pheromones. They quickly put together, we could use this to trap these moths. This was happened back in the 1970s, and at the time it only allowed us to track male flight. That has since been expanded to females, and it was a huge step forward in the ease of monitoring. Now, we did have things like bait pans and black lights that codling moth would fly to, and these can still be used, but pheromone traps are by far less messy and easier to use. We also used to use virgin females to bait the traps with, and boy, that was tough. You talk about an effort. So when the synthetic lure replaced that, the female that is, it meant anybody could go out and trap for codling moth. So what exactly influences trap capture? And the trouble is there's a whole lot of stuff that does influence trap capture. First of all, and Don alluded to this also, the temperatures at dusk. This is when codling moth come out to play. and will be flying around. So if it's too cold or too windy, they won't come out. If it's raining, they won't come out and respond to pheromones. The trap placement, whether it's the border or the interior, may make quite a bit of difference in terms of the appearancy of that trap, or if you have an outside source, that can make a huge difference. The height in the tree, we've known for a long time, that height makes a difference. Trap geometry, the shape of the trap. Lures have undergone a huge evolution in the past 20 years or so. Both their components and the loads. The age of the lure, of course, lures age as they stay out in the field. But a huge factor in the performance of a trap is actually mating disruption itself, because if you remember the early days, the indication of whether your mating disruption is working is it shut down your trap catch. So we responded by upping the lure load to try to overcome that shutdown effect. But basically, we no longer have an undisturbed situation of a codling moth responding to a pheromone. The other thing, of course, that makes a huge difference is where you are in the emergence curve. If you're between generations, you're not going to get a lot of adults. If you're at the peak of one of the flights, then you could expect to see a lot more. But last but not least, what you're trying to estimate with that trap is codling moth density. And that's the X factor. But what you might be measuring is any of the other dozen things that are going on in the field. And that's what makes pheromone trapping so very challenging. So a little bit more, and fortunately Don covered this pretty well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. But we see this threshold for flight based on temperature. You don't get any activity below 60 degrees, and they won't actually mate above 62. And you hit the optimum somewhere around 70 degrees. So it's not an on-off switch. As it gets warmer, they are much more likely to fly and to mate. Height in the tree. You want to be in the upper third of the canopy. If you stick that trap too low, where it's easy to look at and easy to find, you'll catch some moths, but you'll not catch the same number as if you had them in the tops of the trees. This is something we learned a long time ago, and that's why everybody puts their codling moth traps up on a pole so that they can get the optimum catch. Now, this is a graph that Vince Jones showed and Mike Dorr and Jay Bruner showed in a number of their talks over the years. And it shows the difference in trap catch when you had a really high density of traps on a pretty substantial size block. And the size of the bubble here is the difference in seasonal trap catch. And the orchard was relatively flat and relatively uniform, so they don't think that made a huge difference. So there are 2 points here, is that if you just had one trap, let's say this one right here, you might get a very different idea of what the population was in your orchard than if you had a trap right here. And that is one of the tricky parts about sampling. And the point that I will make is that the more traps you have, that you can have an average of all of these different points, the more confident you are going to be of what your population is. So I did some experiments with sterile moths when I was working on this a few years ago. And one of the things I wanted to eliminate was the point in the phenology cycle, or the unknown density. So I controlled the density by releasing the same number every week in the exact same spot. And every single release was the same number of moths, and it was 1 row over and 20 feet to the west. So this should have been really, really uniform. And it wasn't. So we had 3 different blocks here, and as you can see, some of these traps at the upper edge of the orchard always caught more moths. Some of these traps were actually relatively uniform, but they were released at the same rate as these traps down here, and look at the difference in catch. So again, if you were trying to estimate codling moth density from data as variable as this, you would have a problem. So this is another graph that I like to show, and it looks like the emergence curve of the second generation. See, the first flight has ended, they're starting to come out again. That's not what it is. These are sterile moths released at the exact same rate every week, 800 moths every single week. So all of this variation right here is largely due to the weather that week. We had some cold, rainy days there. Even though it was June, we had some cold, rainy days. This is up north. And then the weather got better and we started to catch more. But if you're trying to make a decision at this point in time here, how different would your decision be if you saw that many moths versus that many moths? So that is some of the intricacies of trapping. But I don't want to discourage you from trapping despite this. Just you need to bring in a lot of other information, which is block history, fruit sampling, information from bands, historical data. All of those things should be brought into your decision making, not just one trap in a 20-acre block. That's what we're really trying to avoid. The other thing is that in terms of using it for a threshold, especially for the first generation, my feeling is you may as well just commit to controlling the first generation. There's going to be very few situations where you don't, and you will make your life better the rest of the season if you do a good job in the first generation. And that is a good segue into talking about insecticides. We've come a long ways over the past 100 years or so in our control of codling moth, and the first thing you see is that we used to have pretty much one material at a time, and usually it was pretty toxic in one way or another. And about in the mid-2000s or the early 2000s, we suddenly got a diversity of different modes of action. And that is actually really important for resistance management. At last, we had enough materials to actually put on a resistance management scheme. And then we had mating disruption on top of that to help all of these materials along in terms of their efficacy. And that's when we were really able to do a decent job of resistance management. So here is the program that was developed by G. Bruner and his staff in back in the again about the 2010s, when we started to get these new insecticides, and we also knew that glutathione was going to go away. And that happened, I think the last use of glutathione was in 2012. So we were queued up and ready to have these new materials put into a slightly different program. And this is the delayed first cover. And that's what Jay developed. And the reason that got developed is because we didn't have glutathione anymore. We didn't have a 3-week residue. And if you wanted to get good coverage of the first generation, you probably needed 3 applications to cover the whole generation. And his thinking is use that ovicide up front when you have a lot of eggs, and then save those larvicides for when you have the peak numbers of larvae. So you got the most bang for your buck with a delayed first cover. It's a little more optional in the second generation. You can still do ovicide, larvicide in the second generation, or the third for that matter, but it's probably most critical in the first generation. And then, of course, the way to start every season, mating disruption applied before bloom. So, a little bit more detail about some old and some new insecticides, because for the first time in many years, we have some new insecticides. I took over testing codling moth when Jay retired in 2015, and I haven't had a lot new to talk about. You can sort of see them in order of age, the oldest at the top and the youngest at the bottom. But here are some of the candidate materials that we have used or will use for codling moth control. And the ones I want to focus on a little bit today are the newer ones. And this is plinazolin, and this is a new mode of action group from Syngenta, and you're probably going to hear about that in meetings throughout the year. And then the other one that is not yet registered, I think, don't quote me on this, I think they're looking at availability in 2025 with registration maybe late in 2024. And then the other new one, again, a completely different mode of action from anything we've used in the past, is the peptides. And I'm not going to try to pronounce that entire thing. Let's just call them generically the peptides, and of which spearlep is the material that's available in tree fruit. So with that, I want to dive into some of the trials that I've done. And we did put out a trial in 2020, but it was a victim of COVID and never got off the ground. But in 2021, we were able to put out a trial. Except for the pressure was a lot lower than is typical for our research orchard. Like I said, we know how to grow a codling moth here at WSU, but for whatever reason, I think we'd sprayed out our research orchards the year before. We didn't get a lot of pressure. The other odd thing about 2021 was the record high temperatures. We had 23 days, and this is just at our Sunrise Research Orchard, we had 23 days where the daily maximum exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And as a result, we had some of the record high degree day accumulations in June and July. So in no way was this, I would call this a typical year. And I think when I come to the end of this, our conclusion will be is there is no such thing as a typical year. So here's the results of this trial. And again, I sort of highlighted the plinazolin. We looked at it. This was a 3-generation test because, again, we were racking up the degree days, and we were looking at rotation schemes with different modes of action in different generations. So here's plinazolin for the first generation, followed by different combinations of materials we've been using for a few years. Here it is in the second generation and the third generation. And basically, there's not a whole lot of difference between any of these programs. They all work. We actually got some really good performance out of programs that we've been doing for years. So at least in our research orchard, we still get good control with the existing materials. But plinazolin, especially looking very, very good when we put it in the second generation. I don't think that means it can only be used then. That's just the way that test came out. Okay, 2022. So this was another unusual year. We had a famously cool and wet spring, which is just the kind of weather that codling moth hate to fly and mate in. So our pressure was, again, much lower than expected. But we came out at about 6% in the check, which is would be a disaster for you, but actually way too low for me. And the other challenge we had in 2022 was that we had this teensy-weensy little hail event at SRO that banged up our goldens almost beyond recognition. And that caused a problem with distinguishing codling moth damage. Well, the deep entries weren't hard to tell. You had that nice pile of frass on the outside of the apple. All of these here, I am pretty sure were just hail marks. But there's a couple that were just, well, was that a sting? Was that a hail mark? It got really hard to tell, especially when you're scanning thousands of fruit very quickly to try to get an estimate of damage. So at the end of the day, we only looked at entries that we were absolutely sure that it was caused by a codling moth. And here is our the results of our 2022 trial. And again, we see 2 different formulations of plinazolin. And the SC was looking a little sharper in this test, and I believe since this time Syngenta has decided to focus on the SC formulation. And again, very, very comparable to what I would call a standard program, which is Alticor followed by Delegate. As I mentioned before, I've also looked at spearlep, the new peptide insecticide for Lepidoptera. This material needs a BT to help get it through the gut wall of the insect. And while this was tested in the same block as the previous results that I just showed you, It was tested on the second generation only, and the first generation was just sort of, it was allowed to run. So it got put out under really high pressure situations relative to that year. And it still actually did a pretty good job of knocking down the amount of damage that we saw. But it got stuck in a high pressure corner of the block after a lot of buildup of the first generation had already happened. Okay, so 2023. We had time for 2 generations this past year, but I wanted to test the materials in what I felt was a normal schedule, which is the delayed first cover. So I put an ovicide out as my first application, followed by 2 larvicides, and then for the first generation, and then just did a couple of larvicides for the second generation. And with a 14-day interval between the 2 larvicides. The one exception is this one right here. Plinazoline is believed to have ovicidal activity also, so instead of using a specific ovicide, we just use plinazoline as our ovicide. So the first thing to notice about 2023, unlike previous years, we had all of the codling moth pressure that a girl could ever want. We had like over 90% damage in our checks. And while that's maybe a little more than I was hoping for, it really helps sort out the treatments. So again, sort of color coding here, all of the treatments that have plinazoline are in green, and you can see they were, they all did pretty well. We didn't have a huge amount of separation in terms of the means. But this one here, where plinazoline was in the 3rd generation, did very well, and a little less well when we had it up here. But still, I would call it, under this phenomenal amount of pressure, a very solid contender relative to our current codling moth materials. So suffice it to say, I think this is, when this does get registered, I think this is going to be again, a solid contender for a place in our codling moth programs. And the fact that it will be a different mode of action makes it much more attractive for resistance management purposes. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about cultural controls. We don't talk about those very much, but there's a couple of things that actually do come under this. And the first is trunk banding, sanitation. It's an oldie but a goodie. They've been doing it for like a century or more, and this can still work. There are still some people who are out there banding their trees, especially if you're in an organic situation and you had a lot of damage in the fall. This is a way to level that playing field for the spring. The other one is nets. They can be drape nets or they can be complete cages, either one. And my student and I studied this for a number of years, and we found that no matter what we did, whether it was a large cage or a small cage, regardless of the year, we always got the least amount of damage inside that cage. Okay, I see I'm at the stopping point, but I also know that this is the break, so I'm going to take a very slight liberty. Okay. Huh? 2 minutes. Okay. Tiana says 2 minutes. And then, of course, we have sterile insect release. This has been used for a quarter century or more in Canada and is a proven technique and has brought their populations down over the years to the point where they really don't have to spray very much for anything else. And it became available in Washington about 2019 and has expanded. They've expanded their business through the state. When we first tested this, it looked like pretty promising results. The more moths we put on, the lower our fruit damage. That was good news and just what we're hoping for. In later years, we didn't see quite the same clear results, but there's still no doubt in my mind that sterile moths can and do work. This was one of our success stories. We had a hot spot on the edge of the block when we first started, and we basically cleaned that up at the end of 3 years. So that is one potential application of sterile moths. The other thing I want to talk about, last but not least, is a fixed spray system. And this was, again, work that was started by Keith Granger and Jay Bruner back in 2010 or thereabouts. And it's basically, instead of using a tractor and sprayer, you plumb the pesticide application into your orchard. And I think there's just a number of reasons why this is such a great idea. And the first is worker safety. That's super important. You don't have a sprayer out there in the middle of a cloud of pesticides. Perfect timing of sprays, prolonging the window in which you can put on a spray, reduce drift, reduce compaction, possibly better labor efficiency. There's just a number of efficiencies to be captured here. The real problem, of course, is it's probably going to be pretty expensive. Basically, you're taking, it's a pneumatic system, you're taking air, shoving your solution through a line. The line then fills a reservoir, and when the reservoir reaches a certain point, it discharges all that it has accumulated, and your spray goes out at precisely 100 gallons per acre every single time you do it. The one problem with the fixed spray system now, which I think can be addressed, is while total deposition is the same, coverage isn't the same, and they're a little bit challenged getting as much as they want on the underside of the leaf. They do very well on the upper side of the leaf. Drift is almost eliminated with this because, again, you don't have a 200-mile-an-hour air blast shoving that spray up through the trees 40 feet above the tops of the trees and then over to whatever's next to the trees. And lastly, the engineers have been working on just saying, well, does this work? And in fact, they, at least in bioassay format, they have had really good luck in determining that they can get good control of codling moth. And that's going to be our litmus test of whether or not these spray systems are going to be a go for a Washington orchard. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention.